The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Cedar Valley like a whispered secret, and Jake Morrison had always been a man who listened to whispers. At 34, his weathered hands told stories of 15 years working the Double M Ranch, every callus earned through dawn to dusk labor that most folks couldn't fathom. The ranch had been his grandfather's dream, his father's burden, and now his own stubborn obsession. 800 acres of Colorado grassland that demanded everything a man had to give and sometimes asked for more. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake pulled his worn Stetson lower over his eyes as he approached the old hay barn, the structure that had stood sentinel on the property for over 60 years. The morning routine was sacred to him. Check the livestock, inspect the fences, ensure the water troughs were full, and then tackle whatever crisis had emerged overnight. Ranch life was predictable in its unpredictability, and Jake had learned to roll with whatever curveball the land decided to throw his way. But nothing could have prepared him for what he discovered that crisp October morning. The barn door, which he distinctly remembered securing the night before, stood slightly ajar. Jake frowned, his hand instinctively moving to the worn leather holster at his hip. Cattle rustlers had been a problem in the area lately, and more than one rancher had woken to find their stock missing and their barns ransacked. His boots crunched softly on the frost-covered ground as he approached, every sense alert to potential danger. He eased the door open wider, expecting to find evidence of theft or vandalism. Instead, he found something that stopped him cold in his tracks. Nestled in a makeshift bed of fresh hay, a young woman lay sleeping, her arms protectively wrapped around two small children who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Beside them, as if appointed guardian of this unlikely trio, stood Gertrude, his prized Nubian goat, chewing thoughtfully on what appeared to be the brim of someone's straw hat. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark hair that had escaped from a simple braid and clothes that spoke of hard travel and harder times. Her face, even in sleep, carried the kind of exhaustion that came from more than just physical fatigue. The children, twins, he realized, noting their identical features, slept peacefully against her, their small faces flushed with the deep contentment of childhood sleep. And there was Gertrude, methodically destroying what looked like a perfectly good hat, her amber eyes fixed on Jake with the kind of innocent expression that suggested she was exactly where she belonged. Jake cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle the sleeping family but needing to understand how they had come to be in his barn. The woman's eyes opened immediately, alert and wary in the way of someone accustomed to danger. She sat up carefully, making sure not to disturb the sleeping children, and Jake could see the moment she realized where she was and that she had been discovered. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fatigue and what might have been unshed tears. "We didn't mean any harm, we were just so tired, and it was getting cold and the children needed somewhere safe to sleep. We'll go now, we won't cause any trouble." Jake held up a hand, noting how she instinctively pulled the children closer to her, ready to protect them with her life if necessary. "Easy there," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used with spooked horses. "Nobody's asking you to go anywhere just yet. I'm Jake Morrison. This is my ranch." The woman's eyes darted around the barn as if calculating escape routes, and Jake realized she was prepared to run despite having nowhere to go. "I'm Sarah," she said finally, the admission seeming to cost her something. "Sarah Chen. These are my boys, Tommy and Timmy." Jake nodded, noting how she hadn't offered a last name for the children. There was a story there, he was certain, and likely not a pleasant one. "Well, Sarah Chen, I'm guessing you and the boys have had quite a journey to end up sleeping in my hay barn with my goat." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Gertrude bleated softly and took another contemplative bite of the hat. Sarah followed Jake's gaze and gasped, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Oh no, I'm so sorry. She was just lying there with us, and I thought she belonged here, and I didn't realize she was eating anything. I'll pay for the hat somehow, I promise." Jake studied the hat in question, or what remained of it. The brim was thoroughly chewed, and Gertrude was now working on the crown with the focused determination of a gourmet enjoying a fine meal. He couldn't help but smile, despite the unusual circumstances. "Well," he said slowly, "I reckon if Gertrude don't eat the whole thing, you folks can stay put for now." The relief that flooded Sarah's face was so profound that Jake felt something shift in his chest. When was the last time he had seen someone so grateful for such a simple kindness? The twins were beginning to stir, their sleep disturbed by the adult voices, and Jake watched as Sarah immediately shifted into protective mother mode, smoothing their hair and murmuring soft reassurances. "Mama," one of the boys mumbled, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Where are we?" "We're safe, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, though her eyes remained fixed on Jake with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "This is Mr. Morrison's barn, and he's being very kind to us." The boy Tommy or Timmy, Jake couldn't tell which, sat up and looked around with the wide-eyed curiosity of childhood. His gaze landed on Gertrude, who had paused in her hat consumption to study the newly awakened child. "Is that a goat?" the boy asked, his voice filled with wonder. "That's Gertrude," Jake said, crouching down to the child's level. "She's got quite an appetite, as you can see, and apparently, she's got good taste in sleeping companions." The second twin awakened at the sound of voices, and soon both boys were sitting up, looking around the barn with the kind of fascination that only children could muster. They seemed remarkably well behaved for 3-year-olds who had just awakened in a strange place, and Jake found himself wondering what kind of journey had brought them to his doorstep. "Boys, stay close to me," Sarah instructed, but her tone was gentle rather than fearful. Jake noted how she managed to convey both authority and comfort in those simple words, and he filed away another piece of information about this mysterious woman who had appeared in his barn. Gertrude, apparently deciding that the hat had provided sufficient entertainment, wandered over to investigate the twins. Both boys giggled as she sniffed at them with her usual friendly curiosity, and Jake was struck by how natural the scene appeared. It was as if this odd little family had always belonged in his barn, surrounded by hay and watched over by an opinionated goat. "You folks must be hungry," Jake observed, noting the thinness in Sarah's face and the way the boys seemed smaller than typical 3-year-olds. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Sarah's cheeks flushed again, and Jake realized his question had embarrassed her. "We're fine," she said quickly, the response automatic and unconvincing. "We don't want to impose any more than we already have." "Mama, I'm hungry," one of the twins said with the brutal honesty of childhood, and Jake watched Sarah's composure crack slightly around the edges. "I know, baby," she whispered, pulling the boy close. "We'll figure something out." Jake made a decision that would change the course of all their lives, though he couldn't have known it at the time. "Tell you what," he said, standing and brushing hay from his jeans, "it's coming on breakfast time anyway, and I always make too much food for just myself. Why don't you folks come up to the house and we'll get some proper food in those boys?" The offer hung in the air between them, and Jake could see Sarah struggling with pride, desperation, and the deep-seated wariness of someone who had learned that kindness often came with strings attached. She looked at her sons, who were now both openly staring at Jake with the hopeful expressions of children who had been disappointed too many times to ask for what they needed but still couldn't help wanting. "We couldn't," Sarah began, but Jake cut her off with a gentle shake of his head. "Ma'am, I've got fresh eggs from the chickens, bacon from the smokehouse, and enough pancake batter to feed a small army. Those boys look like they could use some good food, and I'm guessing you could too. Besides," he added with a glance at Gertrude, who was now investigating the twins' shoes with scientific interest, "seems like Gertrude has already decided you belong here for the time being." The twins looked up at their mother with identical expressions of hope, and Jake could see the exact moment when Sarah's resolve crumbled. "Just breakfast," she said quietly, "and then we'll be on our way. I don't want to be a burden." "No burden," Jake assured her, though he was already wondering what circumstances had brought a young mother and her twin sons to seek shelter in a stranger's barn. "Come on, let's get some food in you folks." As they made their way from the barn toward the ranch house, Jake couldn't help but notice how Sarah kept the boys close to her, one small hand in each of hers. She moved with the careful awareness of someone accustomed to scanning for threats, and he found himself wondering what she was running from or toward. The ranch house had been built by Jake's grandfather in the 1940s, a solid structure of local stone and weathered wood that had withstood decades of Colorado weather. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable and well-maintained, with a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun and a kitchen that smelled perpetually of coffee and whatever Jake had cooked most recently. Sarah paused at the bottom of the porch steps, and Jake realized she was taking in the sight of his home with the eye of someone who had forgotten what security looked like. The house represented stability, permanence, all the things that seemed to have been missing from her recent experience. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and Jake felt an unexpected pride in her simple compliment. "Grandfather built it to last," he replied, opening the screen door and gesturing for them to enter. "Always said a man's home should be his sanctuary." The kitchen was the heart of the house, just as Jake's grandmother had designed it. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs that had accumulated over the years. The walls were lined with open shelving displaying everyday dishes and the kind of practical cookware that suggested someone who actually knew how to use it. A large window over the sink provided a view of the barn and pastures beyond, allowing Jake to keep an eye on his stock while he worked in the kitchen. The twins remained close to their mother, but Jake could see their eyes taking in everything with the hungry curiosity of children who had been deprived of stability. They settled at the table when Sarah guided them to chairs, their small legs swinging as they waited with the patience of kids who had learned not to expect immediate gratification. Jake moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of a man accustomed to feeding himself, cracking eggs into a large skillet while bacon sizzled in another pan. The smell of cooking food filled the air, and he noticed how both boys' heads turned toward the stove with expressions of anticipation that tugged at something deep in his chest. "Coffee?" he asked Sarah, already reaching for the pot that seemed to brew perpetually on his stove. "Please," she said gratefully, and Jake poured her a large mug, noting how she wrapped her hands around it as if drawing warmth from more than just the liquid inside. As he cooked, Jake found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests. Sarah sat straight in her chair, alert and ready to move at a moment's notice, but there was something in her posture that suggested she was fighting exhaustion. The boys whispered to each other in the way of twins, their conversation consisting of looks and half-words that only they understood. "You boys like pancakes,"
Jake asked, and was rewarded with enthusiastic nods from both children. "We love pancakes," one of them said. "Tommy," Jake thought, noting a small scar above his left eyebrow that distinguished him from his brother. "Mama makes the best pancakes in the whole world." Sarah's smile was soft and sad at the same time. "I used to," she said quietly, "when we had a proper kitchen." The admission hung in the air, another piece of the puzzle that Jake was beginning to assemble. This family had fallen on hard times, that much was clear, but there was more to their story than simple financial hardship. The way Sarah watched the doors and windows, the practiced way she kept the boys within arm's reach, the fact that she had given only her first name, all of it suggested people running from something rather than simply toward something better. Jake served up plates of eggs, bacon and pancakes, setting them in front of his guests with the kind of matter-of-fact hospitality that his grandmother had drilled into him. "Eat up," he said simply. Growing boys need their strength. The twins needed no further encouragement, digging into their food with the enthusiasm of children who had been genuinely hungry. Sarah ate more slowly, but Jake could see the way she savored each bite, as if good food had become a luxury rather than an expectation. "This is delicious," she said after a few minutes. "Thank you. You didn't have to do this." "Everybody's got to eat," Jake replied, settling into his own chair with a plate of food. "Besides, it's nice to have company for breakfast. Gets quiet out here sometimes." "You live alone?" Sarah asked, then immediately looked embarrassed by the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "No harm in asking," Jake said easily. "Yeah, it's just me and the animals. Has been for about 5 years now, since my dad passed." "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said with the kind of genuine sympathy that suggested she understood grief personally. Jake nodded his thanks, then found himself curious about her own circumstances. "What about you folks? You traveling through or looking to settle somewhere?" He saw Sarah's guard go up immediately, the wariness returning to her eyes. "We're looking for a fresh start," she said carefully. "Somewhere the boys can have a good life." It was a non-answer, but Jake didn't push. Whatever had brought them to his barn, it was clear that Sarah wasn't ready to share the full story. That was fine with him. Everyone deserved their privacy, and he had learned that people would tell you what they needed you to know when they were ready. The twins finished their breakfast with the speed of hungry children, then sat back in their chairs with expressions of contentment that warmed Jake's heart. They had some color in their cheeks now, and the hollow look around their eyes had softened. "Can we see the goat again?" Timmy asked, his voice hopeful. "That's up to your mama," Jake said, glancing at Sarah, "but I reckon Gertrude would enjoy the company. She's got opinions about most things, and she's not shy about sharing them." Sarah looked at her son's eager faces, then at Jake. "We shouldn't stay much longer," she said, though he could hear the reluctance in her voice. "We've imposed enough already." "Where you headed?" Jake asked casually, refilling her coffee cup. Again he saw that flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "We're not sure yet," she admitted. "We'll figure something out." Jake studied her face, noting the exhaustion that good food and coffee couldn't completely hide. "You got family somewhere? Friends who might take you in?" Sarah's laugh was hollow. "No family. And the friends we had? Well, let's just say circumstances changed." There was a story there, Jake was certain, and likely not a pleasant one. He found himself thinking about the way she had awakened instantly alert in the barn, the careful way she watched her surroundings, the practiced manner in which she kept the boys close. These weren't the behaviors of someone simply down on their luck. They were the behaviors of someone running from real danger. "Well," he said slowly, "seems to me like you folks might benefit from staying put for a day or two. Get some rest. Figure out your next move without having to worry about where you're sleeping tonight." Sarah's eyes widened. "We couldn't ask you to do that. You've already done so much." "You're not asking," Jake pointed out. "I'm offering. And before you start worrying about imposing, let me tell you something. I've got a ranch to run, which means I'm up before dawn and working until after sunset most days. Having you folks around wouldn't be a burden. It might actually be helpful." "Helpful? How?" Sarah asked suspiciously, as if she had learned to question offers of assistance. Jake gestured toward the twins, who were now whispering to each other about the goat with the kind of animated excitement that suggested they hadn't had much to be excited about recently. "Well, for starters, Gertrude's been getting ornery lately, and I think it's because she's bored. Those boys of yours seem to have caught her interest, and a happy goat is a productive goat." It was a thin excuse and they both knew it, but Jake could see Sarah considering the offer. He pressed on gently. "Besides, I could use some help around here. Nothing too strenuous, maybe some cooking, light cleaning, keeping an eye on things while I'm out with the stock. In exchange, you folks would have a roof over your heads and regular meals while you figure out what comes next." The offer hung between them, and Jake could practically see the war being fought behind Sarah's eyes. Pride battled with desperation, independence with the need to provide security for her children. The twins, oblivious to their mother's internal struggle, continued their whispered conference about goats and barns and the novelty of having eaten until they were full. "Just for a day or two," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "until we can figure out where to go next." Jake nodded, keeping his expression carefully neutral despite the satisfaction he felt at her acceptance. "Just until you get your bearings," he agreed. "No pressure, no strings attached." But even as he said the words, Jake had a feeling that this arrangement might last longer than either of them anticipated. There was something about this small, determined family that had already begun to fill spaces in his life he hadn't realized were empty. And as he watched the twins' faces light up with joy at the prospect of spending more time with Gertrude, he found himself hoping that Sarah's day or two might stretch into something more substantial. After breakfast, Jake showed them around the immediate area of the ranch, pointing out the chicken coop, the vegetable garden his grandmother had planted decades ago and that he still maintained, and the small creek that provided fresh water for the stock. The twins were fascinated by everything, asking endless questions with the curiosity of children who had been cooped up for too long. Sarah walked beside them, and Jake noticed how she seemed to relax slightly as she took in the peaceful surroundings. The ranch was isolated enough to provide privacy, but not so remote as to feel cut off from civilization. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of place someone might choose if they were looking for a safe haven from whatever storms had driven them to seek shelter in a stranger's barn. As they approached the barn where Gertrude held court, Jake found himself making a decision that surprised him with its spontaneity. "Tell you what," he said, stopping beside the fence that enclosed the goat's domain. "Why don't you folks settle in properly? There's a small apartment above the barn that my grandfather built for seasonal help. It's got running water, a little kitchen, even a bathroom. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and comfortable." Sarah turned to stare at him, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Morrison, Jake, I can't let you do that. We're strangers. You don't know anything about us." "I know enough," Jake said quietly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I know you're a good mother who'd sleep in a barn to keep her children safe. I know you raised boys who say please and thank you and don't destroy other people's property. I know you're running from something that scared you enough to leave everything behind, and I know you're strong enough to keep going even when you're barely hanging on. The accuracy of his assessment brought tears to Sarah's eyes, and she looked away quickly, as if ashamed of the emotion. "You don't understand," she said. "We might be trouble, people might come looking for us. Let them come," Jake said with a quiet conviction that surprised even him. "This is my land, and I decide who's welcome on it." The twins had climbed onto the fence to get a better view of Gertrude, who was performing what appeared to be an interpretive dance involving a feed bucket and a great deal of bleating. Their laughter filled the air, the sound so purely joyful that it seemed to settle something in Sarah's expression. "1 week," she said finally. "We'll stay 1 week, help you with whatever needs doing, and then we'll move on. I won't have you getting involved in our troubles." Jake nodded, though privately he suspected that 1 week might not be nearly enough time to sort out whatever had brought them to his doorstep. "1 week it is," he agreed. "But if circumstances change, if you need more time, or if those troubles you're worried about turn out to be more manageable than you think, the offer stands." As they walked toward the barn to inspect the apartment that would serve as temporary housing for his unexpected guests, Jake found himself wondering what exactly he had gotten himself into. He was a simple rancher, accustomed to the straightforward challenges of livestock and weather, and market prices. Human complications were decidedly outside his area of expertise. But as he watched Sarah's shoulders relax slightly and saw the first genuine smile she had offered since awakening in his barn, Jake realized that some complications might be worth the trouble they brought. And if Gertrude's enthusiastic bleating was any indication, his opinionated goat heartily approved of the new arrangements. The apartment above the barn was small but well appointed, with 2 bedrooms, a compact kitchen, and a sitting area that looked out over the pastures. Jake's grandfather had built it during the ranch's more prosperous days, when seasonal help was necessary for managing larger herds. It had been empty for years, but Jake kept it clean and in good repair out of respect for the old man's memory. Sarah stood in the doorway, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings, the clean linens on the beds, the small refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen corner. "It's perfect," she said softly, and Jake could hear the amazement in her voice, as if she had forgotten that such simple comforts existed. The twins had already claimed the smaller bedroom, bouncing on the twin beds with the excitement of children who hadn't had beds of their own for quite some time. Through the window they could see Gertrude in the pasture below, and Jake suspected that goat watching was going to become their new favorite pastime. "I'll let you folks get settled," Jake said, heading toward the door. "I've got some fence work to do on the south pasture, but I'll be back around lunchtime. Make yourselves at home." Sarah followed him to the door, her expression serious. "Jake," she said quietly, "I want you to know that we're grateful, more grateful than I can express, but I also want you to understand that if anyone comes looking for us, if there's any sign of trouble, we'll leave immediately. I won't put you in danger because of our problems." Jake studied her face, noting the determination in her green eyes, and the way she held herself, ready to fight or flee as circumstances demanded. "I appreciate the warning," he said, "but Sarah, whatever those problems are, they're not bigger than the size of this ranch, or the stubbornness of the man who owns it. You let me worry about what I can and can't handle." As he walked away from the barn, Jake found himself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether the weather would hold long enough to finish the hay harvest. Now he was housing a mysterious family and making promises to protect people he barely knew from threats he couldn't identify. But as he heard the twins' laughter floating down from the apartment window and thought about the way Sarah's face had softened when she saw the comfortable rooms that would shelter her children, Jake realized he didn't regret his impulsive offer. The ranch had felt empty for too long, haunted by the memories of family long gone and dreams that had never quite materialized. Maybe it was time for some new dreams. Maybe it was time to remember that a ranch wasn't just about the land and the livestock, it was about the people who called it home. And as Gertrude bleated her approval from the pasture below, Jake couldn't help but smile. If his opinionated goat thought this arrangement was a good idea, who was he to argue? The morning of Sarah's fourth day at the Double M Ranch dawned with an unexpected complication. Jake was returning from his usual pre-dawn check of the cattle when he spotted a plume of dust rising from the access road that led to his property. Visitors were rare at the ranch, and unannounced visitors were practically unheard of. His stomach tightened as he remembered Sarah's warnings about people who might come looking for them. He quickened his pace toward the barn where he could see Sarah hanging laundry on a makeshift line she had strung between two fence posts. The sight of her simple domestic activity filled him with an unexpected sense of rightness, as if the ranch had been waiting years for someone to bring such life to its daily rhythms. But the approaching vehicle meant that their peaceful routine was about to be interrupted. "Sarah," he called quietly, not wanting to alarm the twins who were playing nearby with Gertrude. "We've got company coming up the road." The transformation in Sarah was immediate and complete. The relaxed woman who had been humming softly while hanging sheets became instantly alert, her body tensing as she scanned the horizon. Her hands moved automatically to smooth her hair and check that her clothes were presentable, but Jake could see the fear flickering in her eyes. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anxiety he could read in her posture. "Looks like just one vehicle," Jake replied, though he kept his tone calm and reassuring. "Could be anyone. Feed salesman. Neighbor checking on things, maybe someone lost looking for directions." But even as he said the words, Jake found himself hoping it was nothing more threatening than a lost tourist. The way Sarah had gone pale at the mention of visitors suggested that whoever might be looking for her represented genuine danger, and Jake felt a protective instinct rise in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. "Boys," Sarah called softly to the twins who were attempting to teach Gertrude to fetch a stick with limited success. "Come here for a minute." Tommy and Timmy abandoned their game immediately, responding to the subtle change in their mother's tone with the kind of instant obedience that spoke of hard-learned lessons about when to listen without question. They moved to Sarah's side and Jake watched as she knelt to their level, speaking in low, urgent tones. "Remember what we talked about when we first came here," she said quietly. "About staying close to Mama when strangers come around? I need you boys to go up to the apartment right now and stay there until I come get you. Can you do that for me?" The twins nodded solemnly, their young faces reflecting a seriousness that no 3-year-old should have to carry. They hugged their mother quickly, then ran toward the barn with the disciplined speed of children who understood that some games were not games at all. Jake felt his jaw tighten as he watched the boys disappear into the barn. Whatever had driven this family to seek shelter in his hay barn, it had trained those children to recognize danger and respond to it with an efficiency that spoke of experience. No child should have to learn such lessons. The approaching vehicle was close enough now that Jake could make out details. It was a black sedan, clean and well-maintained with tinted windows that prevented him from seeing the occupants. Not the kind of car he would expect from a lost tourist or a neighboring rancher. "That your husband's family?" Jake asked quietly, making an educated guess based on Sarah's reaction. Sarah shook her head, her eyes never leaving the approaching car. "No family," she said tersely. "Daniel was an only child, and his parents died before we met." The sedan pulled to a stop in front of the ranch house, and Jake found himself automatically positioning his body between Sarah and the vehicle. Two men emerged from the car, both wearing dark suits that seemed impractical for the Colorado countryside. They moved with the careful precision of people accustomed to assessing threats and controlling situations. The older of the two men, probably in his 50s with graying hair and cold blue eyes, approached with the confident stride of someone used to getting answers to his questions. His companion was younger, broader across the shoulders, and carried himself with the alertness of professional security. "Afternoon," the older man called out with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're looking for someone, wondering if you might have seen her around these parts." Jake kept his expression neutral, drawing on years of poker games with neighboring ranchers to maintain a facade of casual interest. "Depends on who you're looking for," he replied. "Don't get many strangers through here." The man reached into his jacket pocket, and Jake tensed slightly until he realized the man was pulling out a photograph rather than a weapon. Young woman, about 25, dark hair, traveling with two small children, twin boys. Her name is Sarah Chen, though she might be using a different name. Jake accepted the photograph with steady hands, though his pulse quickened when he saw Sarah's face looking back at him from the glossy paper. It was a professional headshot, the kind used for employee identification or official documents. Sarah looked younger in the photo, less careworn, with a smile that suggested she had once known happiness without fear. "Pretty woman," Jake observed neutrally, handing the photo back. "Can't say I've seen her though.
What's your interest in finding her? The man's smile became more pronounced, though it remained devoid of warmth. I'm Richard Blackstone, he said, as if the name should mean something to Jake. I represent certain business interests that Mrs. Chen was involved with in California. She left rather suddenly, and there are some financial matters that need to be resolved. Jake had dealt with enough dishonest horse traders and cattle buyers to recognize a lie when he heard one. This man might indeed be named Richard Blackstone, but whatever his real interest in Sarah, it had nothing to do with routine financial matters. California's a long way from here, Jake observed. What makes you think she'd come to Colorado? Mrs. Chen has some romantic notions about rural life, Blackstone replied smoothly. We thought she might seek out somewhere quiet to lay low while she considers her options. Behind him, Jake could feel Sarah's tension like a living thing. She had moved closer to the barn, positioning herself where she could reach the twins quickly if necessary, but she was trying to appear casual about her retreat. Well, like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description, Jake said with the kind of finality that usually ended conversations. But I'll keep an eye out. You got a card or something in case she turns up? Blackstone studied Jake's face with the intensity of someone trained to read deception. That's very cooperative of you, Mr. Court. Morrison. Jake Morrison. This is my ranch. Mr. Morrison, Blackstone repeated as if committing the name to memory. I appreciate your willingness to help, but I wonder if we might take a look around. Just to be thorough, you understand. The request was phrased politely, but Jake caught the underlying edge of authority in the man's voice. This was someone accustomed to having his requests treated as commands, and Jake felt his own stubborn streak rising in response. Don't think that'll be necessary, Jake said firmly. As you can see, there's not much here but cattle and outbuildings. If the lady was hiding out on my property, I'd know about it. The younger man had been scanning the area during their conversation, and Jake saw his gaze linger on the laundry line where Sarah's clothes hung drying in the afternoon breeze. Among the work shirts and jeans, a few smaller items were clearly sized for children. Nice day for doing laundry, the younger man observed casually. Jake followed his gaze and felt his heart sink slightly. The children's clothes were a dead giveaway, and he could see that both men had noticed them. Yeah, finally got around to washing some things, he said, hoping his voice sounded natural. Been putting it off too long. Blackstone's eyes sharpened with interest. Those look like children's clothes, he said. I thought you lived alone out here. Neighbor's kids, Jake replied without hesitation. Their washing machine broke down, so their mom brought some things over. Rural neighbors help each other out. It was a reasonable explanation, and for a moment Jake thought it might be accepted. But Blackstone was studying the clothes on the line with the focused attention of someone trained to notice details. Funny thing, Blackstone said conversationally. Those clothes look like they'd fit boys about 3 years old. Twin boys, maybe, given that there are two of everything. The game was up, and Jake knew it. But he also knew that admitting defeat now would put Sarah and the twins in immediate danger. He had made a commitment to protect them, and he intended to honor it, regardless of the consequences. Mister, I've been polite so far, Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge. But you're starting to overstay your welcome. I've told you I haven't seen the woman in your picture, and I've explained about the laundry. If you've got some kind of legal authority to search my property, you're welcome to show it to me. Otherwise, I think it's time for you to move along. Blackstone's pleasant facade began to crack, revealing something colder underneath. Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. Sarah Chen is involved in some very serious matters. If you're harboring her, you could be making yourself an accessory to federal crimes. Federal crimes? Jake repeated, raising an eyebrow. That's a pretty serious accusation. You boys federal agents? Because if you are, you should have shown me some identification right off. And if you're not, well then you're just a couple of guys in suits making threats on my property. The younger man shifted slightly, and Jake caught a glimpse of a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. These men were armed, which confirmed his suspicion that their interest in Sarah was far from benign. But Jake had his own weapons, including intimate knowledge of every inch of his property and the home field advantage that came with it. Look, Morrison, Blackstone said, dropping his pretense of politeness, we know she's here. The car rental records show she returned a vehicle in Denver 3 days ago. The bus station has her buying tickets to this general area. A woman matching her description was seen with 2 children at a diner about 20 miles from here yesterday morning. Jake's heart sank as he realized how thoroughly they had tracked Sarah's movements. She had been careful but not careful enough to evade professional pursuit. These men knew she was in the area, and they were systematically checking every possible hiding place. Even if that's all true, Jake said steadily, it doesn't mean she's here. Could have caught another bus, hitched a ride, any number of things. Could have, Blackstone agreed, but those children's clothes suggest otherwise. And the fact that you're being so uncooperative makes me think you have something to hide. From the corner of his eye, Jake saw movement at one of the barn's upper windows. Sarah was watching from the apartment, probably trying to assess the situation and determine whether she needed to run with the boys. The thought of her trying to flee across open countryside with 2 small children while being pursued by armed men made Jake's blood run cold. Tell you what, Jake said, making a decision that surprised even him. You boys want to search my property? Go ahead. But you're going to do it legal-like. I'm calling the sheriff and he can supervise your search. If you've really got federal authority, you won't mind waiting for local law enforcement to verify your credentials. Jake pulled his cell phone from his pocket, but before he could dial, the younger man stepped forward aggressively. I don't think that's necessary, he said, his hand moving toward his jacket. Easy there, partner, Jake said quietly, his own hand dropping to rest on the butt of the Colt 45 he wore on his hip. No need for things to get unpleasant. But if you're reaching for what I think you're reaching for, you should know that this is my land. You're trespassing, and Colorado has pretty generous laws about defending your property. The tension stretched between them like a taut wire, and Jake could feel the situation balancing on a knife's edge. These men were clearly willing to use violence to achieve their goals, but they were also smart enough to realize that shooting a rancher on his own property would create complications they didn't want to deal with. Gentlemen, a new voice called from behind them, and Jake felt relief flood through him as he recognized Sheriff Daniels approaching from the direction of the house. Afternoon, Jake. These fellows bothering you? Sheriff Tom Daniels was in his 60s, a career lawman who had been keeping the peace in this county for over 30 years. He was also Jake's neighbor and longtime friend, and Jake had never been happier to see the older man's weathered face and steady demeanor. Sheriff, Jake said with genuine warmth, these gentlemen are looking for someone, claimed they might want to search my property. I was just about to call you to make sure everything was handled proper-like. Daniels nodded, his experienced eyes taking in the scene and clearly noting the tension between the men. Well, that's considerate of you, Jake, and you gentlemen are. Blackstone had recovered his composure quickly, smoothing his expression back into professional courtesy. Richard Blackstone, he said, extending his hand to the sheriff, I represent a private investigation firm. We're looking for a missing person, and we have reason to believe she might be in this area. Private investigators, Daniels repeated thoughtfully. You boys got licenses I can take a look at. The request seemed to catch Blackstone off guard, and Jake saw him exchange a quick glance with his companion.
Of course, Blackstone said, but there was a slight hesitation in his voice. Though I should mention that this is a sensitive matter involving potential federal crimes, discretion is important. Oh, I'm always discreet, Daniels assured him with the kind of genial smile that Jake knew masked a sharp intelligence, but I'm also thorough. In my experience, when folks come onto private property making demands, it's best to make sure everyone's credentials are in order. Jake watched as Blackstone weighed his options. Producing false identification to a sheriff would be a serious crime, but refusing to show any identification would effectively end their ability to search the property. Either way, Jake realized their presence here was about to become much more complicated. Sheriff, Blackstone said finally, perhaps we could discuss this privately? There are aspects of this case that require a certain level of clearance to discuss. Daniel's smile remained friendly, but Jake could see the skepticism in his eyes. Well now, that sounds mighty important. Tell you what, why don't you gentlemen follow me back to the station? We can get everything sorted out proper like there, and if you need to search Mr. Morrison's property, we can arrange that through official channels. It was a masterful move, Jake realized. Daniels was giving the men a face-saving way to leave the property, while making it clear that any further action would have to go through proper legal procedures. If they were legitimate investigators, they would have no problem with the sheriff's suggestion. If they weren't, they were now in a position where refusing would raise serious questions about their authority. Blackstone looked around the ranch one more time, his gaze lingering on the barn where Jake knew Sarah and the twins were hiding. That may not be necessary, he said finally. We'll continue our investigation through other channels. You sure? Daniels asked. No trouble at all to get the paperwork sorted out. No, we've taken enough of everyone's time today, Blackstone replied, though Jake could hear the frustration in his voice. Mr. Morrison, thank you for your cooperation. If you do happen to see the woman in the photograph, I hope you'll give us a call. He handed Jake a business card with a phone number and nothing else. No company name, no address, just a number printed on expensive cardstock. I'll keep it in mind, Jake said neutrally, pocketing the card without looking at it. The two men returned to their sedan, and Jake watched as they drove away, noting that they turned toward town rather than continuing further into the rural areas where other ranches might provide hiding places. That suggested they were either giving up on this area or planning to return with better preparation. Friends of yours? Daniels asked casually as the dust settled. Never saw them before today, Jake replied honestly. They were asking about a woman and some kids, said she was involved in some kind of financial trouble. Daniels nodded thoughtfully. Funny thing about private investigators, he said, the legitimate ones usually carry proper identification and don't mind showing it to local law enforcement. Makes me wonder what kind of investigation they're really conducting. Jake felt a surge of gratitude for the sheriff's subtle support. Yeah, that struck me as odd too. Seemed mighty eager to search my property without any legal authority. Well, if they come back, you give me a call, Daniel said. And Jake, if you happen to be helping someone who needs help, just remember that there are legal ways to go about it. We've got resources for people in trouble, ways to keep them safe while we sort out what kind of trouble they're really in. The offer was carefully phrased. giving Jake plausible deniability while making it clear that the sheriff suspected there was more to the situation than met the eye. It was also an invitation to trust local law enforcement with whatever was really happening at the Double M Ranch. "I appreciate that, Tom," Jake said. "If the situation arises, I'll keep it in mind." Daniels nodded and climbed back into his patrol car, but before driving away, he rolled down his window. "By the way, Jake, nice day for doing laundry," he said with a meaningful look toward the clothesline. Funny how some folks notice details like that. As the sheriff's car disappeared down the access road, Jake turned toward the barn, knowing that Sarah would be watching and waiting for some sign that it was safe to come out. The immediate crisis had passed, but it had also made clear that their sanctuary at the Double M Ranch was not as secure as he had hoped. He found Sarah standing at the bottom of the barn stairs, her face pale but composed. The twins were visible at the top of the stairs, clearly having been instructed to stay out of sight but close enough to run if necessary. "They're gone," Jake said simply. "For now." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained tense. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back, and next time they'll be better prepared." "Who are they, Sarah?" Jake asked gently. "What do they want with you?" Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and Jake could see her struggling with how much to reveal. The afternoon's events had made it clear that her presence at the ranch was putting him in danger, and he deserved to know what he was risking by helping her. "My husband Daniel worked for a company called Meridian Technologies," she said finally. "They develop software for financial institutions, supposedly, but Daniel discovered that they were also doing work for some very questionable clients. Money laundering, identity theft, helping criminal organizations hide their assets." Jake felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. "Your husband was going to blow the whistle." "He tried to go through proper channels first," Sarah continued, her voice heavy with memory. "He reported what he found to his supervisors, thinking they would want to clean house. Instead, they offered him a promotion and a significant raise to keep quiet about what he had discovered. But he didn't take it." "Daniel was a good man," Sarah said simply. "He couldn't live with himself knowing that his work was helping criminals hurt innocent people, so he started collecting evidence, planning to take it to the FBI." Jake could guess what had happened next. "They found out," Sarah nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "The typhoid that killed Daniel wasn't typhoid," she said quietly. "It was poison, made to look like a natural illness, but I knew. Daniel was healthy, strong, he didn't just suddenly get sick and die." The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He had suspected that Sarah was running from something dangerous, but murder was beyond what he had imagined. "Why didn't you go to the police? The FBI? With what evidence?" Sarah asked bitterly. "Daniel hid the files he had collected, but I never found them, and Meridian has connections everywhere, including law enforcement. The man who came here today, Richard Blackstone, he's not a private investigator, he's Meridian's head of security, and he has a reputation for making problems disappear permanently." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized how close they had come to disaster. If Blackstone had decided to search the property by force, if Sheriff Daniels hadn't arrived when he did, the confrontation could have ended very differently. "So you ran," he said. "I took the boys and ran," Sarah confirmed. "I cleaned out our bank accounts, sold everything I could quickly, and tried to disappear. But they have resources I can't compete with. They tracked us across the country, and now they've found us here." The twins had crept down the stairs during their conversation, drawn by the serious tone of their mother's voice. They pressed close to Sarah's sides, and Jake could see that they understood enough to be frightened, even if they didn't grasp the full scope of the danger. "Mama," Tommy said quietly, "are we going to have to run again?" Sarah knelt to gather both boys in her arms, and Jake could see her heart breaking as she looked into their trusting faces. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered. "Maybe. But we like it here," Timmy protested. "We like Jake and Gertrude and our room in the barn." The simple statement from the 3-year-old hit Jake harder than any argument Sarah could have made. These children had found stability and happiness at his ranch, perhaps for the first time in months. The thought of them being forced back into a life of fear and uncertainty was unbearable. "Nobody's running anywhere," Jake said firmly, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "This is your home now, and Blackstone and his friends can go to hell." Sarah looked up sharply. "Jake, you don't understand what you're saying. These people killed my husband. They won't hesitate to hurt you too." "Maybe so," Jake acknowledged. "But I've got something they don't have. I've got home field advantage, and I've got friends like Sheriff Daniels who don't take kindly to outsiders making threats in their county." "It's not enough," Sarah said desperately. "They have money, connections, professional killers. You're just one man." Jake smiled grimly. "Lady, you've obviously never seen what one stubborn rancher can do when he sets his mind to protecting something important. Besides, I've got Gertrude on my side, and that goat has never lost a fight in her life." Despite everything, Sarah laughed at that, a sound that was half humor and half hysteria. The twins giggled too, though they probably didn't understand the joke. "This isn't a game, Jake," Sarah said, though some of the desperation had left her voice. "No, it's not," Jake agreed seriously. "But it's also not over. Blackstone may have money and connections, but he's operating outside his comfort zone here.
This is rural Colorado, not some corporate boardroom. Out here people notice strangers, they look out for their neighbors, and they don't much appreciate being threatened. Sarah studied his face, and Jake could see her weighing hope against hard experience. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to stop running and start fighting back, Jake said. But we're going to need help, and we're going to need a plan. As if summoned by his words, Gertrude appeared at the barn door, bleating her opinion on the day's events. She had somehow acquired a work glove, which she was chewing with the same methodical determination she had shown with Jake's hat. Well, Jake said, looking at the goat's focused expression, at least we know Gertrude's ready for whatever comes next. The twins ran to the goat, wrapping their small arms around her neck, and chattering about their afternoon of hiding, and the scary men in suits. Gertrude accepted their attention with regal patience, as if she understood her role as protector of the ranch's newest residents. Sarah watched her sons with an expression that mixed love and fear in equal measure. They deserve better than this, she said quietly. They deserve to have a normal childhood, to feel safe, to not have to hide every time a car comes up the driveway. Then let's make sure they get it, Jake said simply, whatever it takes. As the sun began to set over the Colorado hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken in the past week. He had gone from a solitary rancher with nothing but cattle and memories for company, to a man with a family to protect and enemies to face. It should have terrified him. Instead, he felt more alive than he had in years. The evening brought a planning session around the kitchen table, with Sarah sharing everything she knew about Meridian Technologies and Richard Blackstone while Jake considered their options. The twins played quietly in the living room, building elaborate structures with blocks Jake had found in his attic, remnants of his own childhood visits to the ranch. Blackstone won't give up, Sarah said, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He can't afford to. If word gets out that Meridian was involved in criminal activities, it would destroy the company. Too much money is at stake. So what's his next move? Jake asked. He'll try a different approach, Sarah mused. Today was reconnaissance, testing our defenses and seeing how much local support we have. He knows Sheriff Daniels is suspicious now, so he'll have to be more careful about how he proceeds. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Tom Daniels is a good man, but he's got a whole county to cover. He can't babysit us around the clock. Which means we need to be prepared to defend ourselves, Sarah said grimly. Or we could go on the offensive, Jake suggested. You said your husband hid evidence about Meridian's criminal activities. What if we could find it? Sarah shook her head. I've been looking for months. Daniel was too careful, too paranoid. He hid it somewhere even I couldn't find it. Maybe, Jake said slowly. You've been looking in the wrong places. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, they were interrupted by a commotion from the living room. The twins had apparently decided that their block structures needed to be defended from imaginary invaders, and their battle sounds were growing increasingly elaborate. Boys, quiet down, Sarah called. It's almost bedtime. But Jake had an idea forming, inspired by the children's play. Sarah, he said slowly, how old are Tommy and Timmy? 3, she replied, puzzled by the question. And how long ago did Daniel die? 6 months, Sarah said, pain flickering across her face. Jake did the math, so the boys were 2.5 when it happened. Old enough to understand some things, but young enough that adults might not think they were paying attention. Sarah's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. You think Daniel might have told them something. Kids that age are like sponges, Jake pointed out. They absorb everything, even things adults don't think they're noticing. And if Daniel was trying to hide something from dangerous people, he might have been careful about what he said around you, but less guarded around children he thought were too young to understand. They looked toward the living room, where Tommy and Timmy were now engaged in a complex negotiation about the proper way to stack blocks for maximum defensive effectiveness. It's worth asking, Sarah said slowly. But I don't want to traumatize them by bringing up memories of their father's death. We'll be gentle, Jake assured her. Kids that age often remember things in games and stories. Maybe we can approach it that way. They joined the twins in the living room, and Jake settled on the floor beside their elaborate block construction. That's quite a fortress you boys have built, he observed. What are you defending it from? Bad guys, Tommy said matter-of-factly, like Daddy used to talk about. Sarah and Jake exchanged glances. This was more promising than they had dared hope. Your daddy talked about bad guys? Jake asked casually. Uh-huh, Timmy chimed in. He said we had to keep secrets safe from the bad guys. What kind of secrets? Sarah asked gently, sitting on the floor beside her sons. The secret place, Tommy said importantly. Daddy showed us the secret place where important things go to hide. Sarah's breath caught. Where is the secret place, sweetheart? Both boys looked at each other with the kind of twin communication that bypassed words. Then Tommy pointed toward a framed photograph on Jake's mantelpiece, a picture of the ranch taken from the hill behind the house. Like that place, he said, but different. Different how? Jake asked patiently. It has the special trees, Timmy explained. The ones that make a circle. Jake felt his pulse quicken.
There were several groves of trees on his property, but only one that formed a natural circle. It was an old homestead site, where someone had planted cottonwoods in a ring around what had once been a house. The structure was long gone, but the trees remained, now mature and forming a distinctive circular pattern visible from certain angles. "And Daddy hid something there?" Sarah asked. "In the special box," Tommy confirmed. "The one that looks like a rock but isn't really a rock." Jake's mind raced. A waterproof container disguised as a rock would be nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. And if Daniel had visited the ranch before his death, perhaps scouting locations for his family to disappear to, he could have hidden his evidence there. "Boys," Sarah said carefully, "do you remember going to a place like that with Daddy?" Both children nodded enthusiastically. "We had a picnic," Timmy said, "and Daddy buried the treasure like pirates. But it wasn't really treasure," Tommy added solemnly. "It was grown-up stuff. Daddy said if anything happened to him, we should tell Mama about the secret place." Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her husband had found a way to leave them the evidence they needed, hidden in plain sight but accessible only through the innocent memories of their children. "Can you show us where this place is?" Jake asked gently. The twins looked uncertain for the first time, and Jake realized they were struggling with concepts too adult for their young minds to fully grasp. "It's okay if you can't remember exactly," Sarah assured them, "but if you could help us find it, it might help us stay safe from the bad guys Daddy was worried about." That seemed to make sense to them in the simplified moral universe of childhood. Good guys fought bad guys, and hiding places kept treasures safe from pirates. "We can show you," Tommy said with the confidence of a 3-year-old who had been entrusted with an important mission. "Tomorrow," Jake decided. "We'll go treasure hunting tomorrow." As they tucked the twins into bed that night, Jake felt a mixture of hope and apprehension about what they might find. If Daniel Chen had indeed hidden evidence of Meridian's criminal activities somewhere on the ranch, it could provide the leverage they needed to protect Sarah and the boys permanently. But it could also make them even bigger targets for Blackstone and his associates. The stakes were about to get considerably higher, and Jake found himself wondering if his simple ranch was strong enough to withstand the storm that was coming. Outside, Gertrude bleated her goodnight to the world, a sound that had become as much a part of the ranch's evening routine as Jake's final check of the stock. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, his unusual family was safe under his roof. It would have to be enough. Dawn broke with crystalline clarity over the Double M Ranch, and Jake found himself standing on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist rise from the pastures. Today felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Somewhere on his land lay the evidence that could either save Sarah and her boys or make them targets too valuable to ignore. The twins were awake early, their excitement about the treasure hunt infectious despite the serious nature of their mission. Sarah moved through the morning routine with practiced efficiency, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes constantly swept the horizon for signs of approaching vehicles. "Ready for an adventure, boys?" Jake asked as they finished breakfast. Tommy and Timmy nodded eagerly, their faces bright with anticipation. At 3 years old, they couldn't fully grasp the weight of what they were attempting, which Jake realized might be a blessing. Their memories would be clearer without the burden of understanding the stakes involved. They set out across the ranch on foot, Jake leading them toward the old homestead site where the cottonwoods formed their distinctive circle. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of hay and the distant sound of cattle. Gertrude had insisted on joining their expedition, trotting alongside them with the air of someone who belonged in whatever adventure was unfolding. As they walked, the twins chattered about their memories of the mysterious picnic with their father. The details came in fragments, the way childhood memories often did, but gradually a picture emerged of Daniel Chen carefully selecting a hiding spot that would be secure but accessible to his family if needed. "There," Tommy said suddenly, pointing toward a grove of trees about a quarter-mile ahead. "That's the circle place." Jake studied the formation of mature cottonwoods, their branches creating a natural canopy over what had once been someone's homestead. The trees had grown large over the decades, their trunks forming an almost perfect ring around a grassy clearing where the foundations of an old house were still barely visible beneath years of accumulated soil and vegetation. "This is it?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "Uh-huh," Timmy confirmed. "Daddy said it was special because the trees remembered the family that used to live here." The poetic phrasing was so unlike what Jake would expect from a 3-year-old that he was certain it had come directly from Daniel Chen. It spoke to a man who understood the weight of history and the importance of choosing the right place to entrust with precious secrets. They entered the circle of trees, and Jake was struck by the cathedral-like quality of the space. The morning light filtered through the leaves in golden shafts, illuminating the peaceful clearing where someone had once built dreams of their own. It felt like sacred ground, a fitting place for a father to hide his legacy for his children. "Now where exactly did Daddy bury the treasure?" Sarah asked gently. The twins looked around with the focused concentration of children trying to match their memories to reality. The clearing was perhaps 50 feet across, with several large rocks and fallen logs that could serve as landmarks. "By the big rock that looks like a sleeping bear," Tommy said after a moment. Jake scanned the area and spotted a large boulder near the eastern edge of the clearing. With a little imagination, its weathered contours could indeed resemble a resting animal. He knelt beside it, running his hands over the surface, looking for anything that might be artificial. "Not that one," Tommy said, shaking his head. "The other big rock."
"There's another one," Jake asked, looking around more carefully. "It's smaller," Tommy explained with the patient tone children used when adults were being particularly dense. "But it's the big one because it's important." Sarah joined the search, examining every stone and protrusion in the clearing. It was Gertrude who found it, nosing at what appeared to be an ordinary rock near the center of the space. But when Jake examined it more closely, he realized it was slightly too regular in shape, too perfectly positioned to be entirely natural. "This one?" he asked the twins. Both boys nodded enthusiastically. "That's the treasure rock," Tommy confirmed. Jake worked his fingers around the edges of the object, and discovered it was indeed artificial, a sophisticated geocache container designed to look like natural stone. It took some effort to work it free from the soil where Daniel had carefully positioned it, but eventually it came loose, revealing a waterproof storage container about the size of a shoebox. Sarah's hands trembled as Jake handed her the container. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, were several flash drives, printed documents, and a letter addressed to her in Daniel's careful handwriting. "Is that Daddy's treasure?" Tommy asked, peering at the contents with curiosity. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This is exactly what Daddy wanted us to find." They returned to the ranch house to examine Daniel's legacy in private. The letter explained everything, written in the careful style of a man who knew he might not live to deliver the message in person. Daniel had documented Meridian Technologies' involvement in money laundering operations for criminal organizations, their development of software designed to hide illegal transactions, and their connections to several high-profile murders disguised as accidents or natural deaths. The flash drives contained copies of financial records, email communications, and software code that would be devastating to Meridian if made public. It was exactly the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors would need to dismantle the entire operation. "My God," Sarah breathed as she scrolled through the files on Jake's laptop. Daniel was thorough. "This is enough to put half of Meridian's executive team in prison for life." Jake read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the scope of the criminal conspiracy. "No wonder they killed him, and no wonder they're so desperate to find you. The question now is what we do with this information," Sarah said. "If we turn it over to the FBI, there's no guarantee they won't have someone on Meridian's payroll who will make it disappear." Before Jake could respond, his phone rang. Sheriff Daniel's name appeared on the display, and Jake answered with a growing sense of unease. "Jake, we've got a problem," the sheriff said without preamble. "Those boys from yesterday, they're back, and they've brought friends. 3 vehicles heading toward your place right now, and they don't look like they're planning to ask permission this time." Jake's blood ran cold. "How long do we have?" "Maybe 10 minutes, Daniels replied. "I'm on my way, but they'll get there first." "Jake, if you've got people there who need protecting, now would be a good time to make sure they're somewhere safe." Jake ended the call and turned to Sarah, who had gone pale as she absorbed his side of the conversation. "They're coming," he said simply. "Multiple vehicles, and they're not planning to be polite about it this time." Sarah was already moving, her survival instincts kicking in with practiced efficiency. "Boys, we need to play the hiding game again," she called to the twins, who were building with blocks in the living room. "But we just found the treasure," Tommy protested. "And now we need to keep it safe from the pirates," Sarah explained, falling back on the simplified narrative that had worked before. Jake made rapid calculations about their options. The ranch house could be defended, but not against multiple armed professionals. The barn was too obvious, but there was another possibility, one that Blackstone and his team wouldn't think to check. "The old root cellar," he said suddenly. "Behind the house, built into the hillside. My grandmother used it for preserving food, but it's got stone walls and only one entrance. If you can get down there with the boys and this evidence, you'll be safe until help arrives." Sarah nodded, understanding immediately. She gathered the flash drives and documents, sealing them back in their waterproof container. "What about you? I'm going to buy you time," Jake said grimly, moving to the gun cabinet where he kept his hunting rifles. "And maybe convince these boys that they picked the wrong ranch to threaten." The sound of approaching vehicles was audible now, multiple engines making no attempt at stealth. Jake helped Sarah and the twins reach the concealed entrance to the root cellar, a heavy wooden door built into the hillside and camouflaged with decades of vegetation growth. "Stay down there no matter what you hear," he instructed. "Sheriff Daniels is on his way, but it might get ugly before he arrives." Sarah grabbed his arm as he turned to leave. "Jake, don't do anything stupid. These boys are killers. So am I when I need to be," Jake replied quietly. "This is my land, my family I'm protecting. They picked the wrong fight." He sealed them into the root cellar and moved back toward the house, checking the loads in his rifles and positioning himself where he could cover the main approaches to the property. Through the window he could see 3 black SUVs pulling up in front of the ranch house, disgorging armed men in tactical gear. Blackstone emerged from the lead vehicle, no longer bothering with his businessman facade. He was dressed in military-style clothing and carried an assault rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who had used such weapons professionally. "Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We know they're here. Make this easy on everyone and send them out." Jake opened the front door but remained in the doorway. his rifle held casually but ready. "Afraid I can't do that," he replied. "You boys are trespassing on private property, and I've got every right to defend it." "You're outnumbered 6-1, Blackstone pointed out. "This doesn't have to end badly for you." "Maybe not," Jake agreed, "but it's definitely going to end badly for some of you. Question is whether you're willing to die for whatever Meridian is paying you." The standoff stretched taut between them, 6 armed men facing one rancher who showed no signs of backing down. Jake could see them calculating odds, considering approaches, trying to determine if he was bluffing about his willingness to fight. The decision was made for them when Gertrude wandered into the yard, apparently curious about the visitors. One of Blackstone's men, nerves on edge from the tension, swung his weapon toward the goat. Jake's rifle cracked once, and the man spun backward, his weapon flying from his hands as Jake's bullet shattered his shoulder. "Next man who points a gun at my goat gets worse than that," Jake announced calmly, working the bolt to chamber another round. The message was clear. Jake Morrison was not a man to be intimidated, and his marksmanship was better than they had expected. The remaining 5 men spread out, looking for cover and better angles of attack. But they had underestimated more than just Jake's shooting skills. They had underestimated the bonds of rural community and the speed with which news traveled in ranching country. Sheriff Daniels arrived with 2 deputies just as Blackstone's team was preparing to storm the house, and the sound of sirens in the distance suggested that more help was on the way. "Federal agents," Blackstone shouted as the patrol cars surrounded the scene. "These people are harboring a fugitive from justice." Sheriff Daniels climbed out of his cruiser with the unhurried confidence of a man who had handled his share of tense situations. "Well now, that's interesting," he drawled, "because I just got off the phone with the real FBI, and they're very curious about your activities, Mr. Blackstone." The color drained from Blackstone's face as he realized his bluff had been called. Jake had used the time while they were searching for the evidence to make some calls of his own, reaching out to contacts who could verify the legitimacy of any federal interest in Sarah and her family. "Turns out," Daniels continued conversationally, "that there's no federal warrant for Sarah Chen or her children. But there is quite a bit of interest in Meridian Technologies and their business practices. Amazing how things work out." The standoff collapsed quickly after that. Faced with local law enforcement, an armed rancher who had already demonstrated his willingness to shoot, and the knowledge that their cover had been blown, Blackstone's team found themselves in an untenable position. Jake called down to the root cellar, signaling that it was safe for Sarah and the boys to emerge. They climbed out into the afternoon sunlight, Tommy and Timmy chattering excitedly about their underground adventure, while Sarah clutched the container of evidence that would finally bring justice for her husband's murder. Sheriff Daniels took custody of Blackstone and his men, though Jake suspected that federal authorities would want to have extensive conversations with them about Meridian's activities. The evidence Daniel had hidden would ensure that the criminal conspiracy he had died trying to expose would finally be brought to light. As the law enforcement vehicles departed with their prisoners, Jake found himself alone with Sarah and the twins in the suddenly quiet ranch yard. Gertrude wandered over to investigate the aftermath, bleating her opinion on the day's excitement. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked, watching the dust settle from the departing vehicles. "Now you're free," Jake replied simply. "You and the boys can go anywhere, do anything. The people who were hunting you are going to be too busy with federal prosecutors to worry about revenge." Sarah looked around the ranch, taking in the peaceful afternoon scene, the distant cattle, the barn where they had found sanctuary. The twins were already running toward Gertrude, eager to share their adventure with their favorite goat. "What if we don't want to go anywhere?" she asked quietly. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Tommy and Timmy have never been as happy as they've been here," Sarah replied. "And neither have I. This place feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has, even after everything that just happened." Sarah smiled, the first truly relaxed smile Jake had seen from her since that morning in the barn. "Especially after everything that just happened. You put your life on the line for us, Jake. You made us part of your family when we were strangers with nowhere else to turn." Jake looked at the twins, who were now engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation with Gertrude about the proper way to celebrate victory over bad guys. "They're good boys," he said. "They deserve to grow up somewhere safe. They deserve to grow up with a father figure who would face down armed men to protect them," Sarah corrected gently. The implication hung in the air between them, full of possibility and promise. Jake had gone from a solitary rancher to the protector of a family in the space of a week, and the transformation felt as natural as breathing. "I suppose Gertrude would never forgive me if I let you folks leave now," he said with a grin. "She's gotten used to having her own personal entertainment committee." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and free in the afternoon air. "We wouldn't want to disappoint Gertrude." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Colorado sky in brilliant colors, Jake reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. A mysterious family sleeping in his barn, a goat with an appetite for hats, and a conspiracy that had nearly cost them everything. But they had survived it all, and in the process they had become something Jake had never expected to find, a real family, bound not by blood but by choice and courage, and the kind of love that grows from facing danger together. Tommy and Timmy were asleep in their beds, exhausted by their day of adventure and secure in the knowledge that the bad guys had been defeated. Sarah sat beside Jake on the porch, swing his grandfather had built, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing something worth saving in 3 strangers who showed up uninvited in your barn." Jake smiled, thinking about that morning that now seemed like a lifetime ago. "Lady, the moment I saw you protecting those boys and Gertrude eating my hat, I knew my life was about to get a whole lot more interesting." And in the distance, as if she knew they were talking about her, Gertrude bleated her agreement with the world in general and the perfect rightness of families that found each other in the most unexpected ways. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.